And our next presenter, our final speaker of the day, and certainly not last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Mark Gruchy from the Community Coalition for Mental Health. So I invite Mr. Gruchy. The clicker's over there. Just use the forward arrow. Okay.
Thank you very much for having me, first and foremost. I really appreciate being asked to speak to such a significant, influential, and prestigious group of people in this particular area. My name is Mark Gruchy, and as was just referenced, I am currently the co-chair of a group called the Community Coalition for Mental Health, which is essentially alliance group and clearinghouse of a number of not-for-profits. For instance, Tree Walsh is down here in the back right now from SWAP. We have John Howard, we have the CMHA, and we have others. We've been ongoing for at least a couple of years and steadily engaged in sharing information and in trying to approach and deal with some of the issues which we're all dealing with here today. When asked to contribute to this particular forum, I had to ask myself what I could possibly bring which could be useful. And I'll start by saying, in being a person who's been involved in the not-for-profit sector of mental health for an extended period of time, I'm also a defense lawyer who works on the front lines with people who have significant mental health problems almost every day. I'm also a person who comes from a family that has dealt with significant mental health problems for an extended period of time. And I'm also an individual who has bipolar disorder, whom was forced out of the school system when he was very young and experienced what that was like and how difficult it was to access health care. So I've lived it, I've experienced it in my loved ones, I've worked in it, and I've worked with people who are neck deep in it every day, all over. And I've been exposed to a lot. I've been exposed to everything from people talking to me in states of psychosis through pieces of glass, wondering what I'm going to do with them because the system doesn't have a place for them to be, to family members having crises. And I got involved in all of this, I guess, really, to fulfill a sense of purpose in my own life and to make some sense out of my own experiences. My presentation is entitled False Dichotomy, and I put it there and describe it as such because when I see the sorts of decision-making processes that we have to engage in when we are faced with what really amount to political decisions about where resources shall be apportioned, we often see positions advanced from one side or the other, and we often find ourselves talking relentlessly in technical terms, jargon, concepts, buzzwords, phrases, and paradigmatic themes. And I've noted in my own knowledge of the development of, I suppose, the dealing, socially speaking, with mental health and mental illness, that this subject is littered with about a century and a half of severe false dichotomies. And the great horror stories of this subject are found in the conflict between those false dichotomies. And it's been going on forever. And what I'm going to suggest in response to the question on the forum about what can we do individually or collectively as a group to advance healthcare outcomes and actually deal with the question of healthcare costs is we need to change our minds about how we think about these concepts. We need to be very, very careful not to fall into false dilemmas which perpetuate the persistent, chronic underfunding, defunding, and neglect of areas respecting the question of mental health in our society. Because we can say very many intelligent things and have very many intelligent ideas, but if we're not aware of the history of what happened and why it happened beyond, oh, they just didn't know what they were doing back in the day, which is not quite the truth, we're going to make the same mistakes again. Because there's been a lot of good people who have tried to do a lot of good things for a long time, and it has been fraught with difficulty. As I'm prone to, I have more slides, I think, than I have minutes. So I'm going to try to go through this as efficiently as possible. We've done that. That's who I am. And we just did that. That's what I'm trying to bring. Having observed what's been going on in our society for at least the last 2 years, I've detected what seems to be a bit of a shift in how we are dealing with the issue of mental health concerns. Not just here, not just in Newfoundland, not just associated with our economy, but rather associated with something different. And just so you guys understand, I really detected a shift in tone when people started trying to get rid of Donald Trump because he was crazy. And I'm not even joking. As a person who has argued strenuously for individuals to be able to be employed and gainfully respected in society, I found it horrifying to watch progressive people say that a person should not be qualified to be the leader of a country because they have a perceived mental illness. And it was jumped on. The bandwagon was jumped on. And it went down that road. And now, if you've been paying attention to the news, Mr. Trump is in the news talking about bringing back the big mental hospitals to deal with the people with the guns. Those two things are linked. When people are prepared to use the concept of mental illness to demonize people, it's perhaps ironic but completely predictable that the person so demonized is talking about bringing back the institutions which we're trying to get away from. One of the themes that happens in this subject that I think is persistent is that everybody is responsible. There are no good guys and bad guys in this struggle. There is a long, interconnected history, a story, which led to a lot of tragedies. And we need to be alive to it, and we need to not get caught in these false dilemmas. So what exactly am I talking about? What is false dichotomy? Very simple. It's two options without acknowledgement of a third option. Say a blended option or a halfway option. It's yay or nay, it's yes or no, it's all or nothing. And they're very dangerous when they interact with politics and economics. This is the question. My answer is we must confront, abolish, and banish the problem posed by these artificial concepts as they are used to justify either neglect or not dealing with problems. Here are some of the false dichotomies that have plagued the entire history of the debate and the discussion about mental health and mental illness. We have nature versus nurture, institutional versus community, extreme coercion versus extreme autonomy, one group's mental health versus another group's mental health, society versus family, and public versus private. All of these issues and concepts have been utilized at different times to justify various lurching hither and yon in the mental health system, which has actually not really benefited anyone except for the people who are advancing the legitimacy of those dichotomies. That's another part of the story. We see an awful lot of people who are regarded as heroic in life as they advance these particular dichotomous concepts, who then end up vilified in death. I'm going to give you some examples because they end up hurting a lot of people, whether they meant it or not. Politics, what is that? Well, we all know what that is. It's the process by which we make decisions. I'm going to suggest that in a democratic society, for the most part, politics is the process by which we make decisions about how we spend money. That's really what it is. That's really what we're doing when we're talking about governance and all of this. We're talking about how money gets spent, and that is a power-negotiated process. We cannot discuss this and hope that someday someone will advance a perfect substantive argument, and suddenly all clouds shall fall away, and we shall understand and agree. It's not like that. And I know there's an awful lot of people here who are incredibly qualified in various areas relevant to the subject, and we'd like to believe, myself included, that we will be listened to. But the reality of it is that we're not always listened to. The best ideas are not always followed. And at the end of the day, what really decides these questions, in my view, is how easy is it to do or not do something from a political perspective. This intersects with the reality of the position of who mentally ill people are. On the one hand, mentally ill people are almost everybody. On the other hand, they're an incredibly marginalized and vulnerable group. Those are some of the raw stats. But I'm going to point out to you right away that if I look at the numbers, say, pertaining to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, we're talking about 3% of the population. And these are the sorts of people who disproportionately find themselves hospitalized in places like the Waterford Hospital. It's dangerous to get too liberal in one's conception of who the mentally ill are, because we forget about the people who are truly and severely suffering in various isolation rooms as we speak right now, who are not in this room. And that's something I've seen persistently throughout my entire activity in this area. The people who are in severe, dire straits never end up in these rooms. I guarantee you there's at least one other person in this room with bipolar disorder at a minimum. We're probably the closest thing to those people who are in TQ right now. We seem to be the people that occasionally break through and manage to get somewhere. And maybe that's why we talk about these things. But the reality of it is that they're generally not here. And they're very vulnerable. I may have to adjust my final fact there about the percentage of funding. I'm not quite sure what it is at the moment. But what we all have in common is a degradation of dignity and autonomy. That's really what ties people with mental illness together more than anything else. And at the end of the day, when you look at all the factors that I have listed here, you have a group which cannot achieve consensus and speak with one voice due to its disparity and frankly, diversity. It is essentially different in an elusive and hard-to-find way, which has consistency over time. The group is socially troublesome, is a problem to be solved, and they've always been exposed to powerful social control mechanisms, which makes them very easy to take things from. It's very easy to delegitimate a group of mentally ill people and say, well, we just won't deal with that right now, because it's only until very recently, and I guess worldwide in the last few decades and recently here, that you've started to see groups of mentally ill people protesting when things are done to them. Other groups protest readily and with great vigor and organizational skill, and you can see how things have gone for them. You can see how things have gone for the LGBT community. You can see how things have gone for women. That's because they're organized. That's because there's some coherence. When you're dealing with people who have serious mental illnesses or otherwise, there is still a struggle to develop that coherence and that unity to be able to say, hey, stop doing this to us. They're really the only identifiable group. We are the only identifiable group that's having a problem doing that right now. This produces the defunding situation using the false dichotomies, which I'll try to elaborate upon. So this particular entry here refers to the beginning, if you will, of what we call modern mental health care. And I've defined it as a period of a conflict of extreme coercion versus extreme autonomy. So the argument that is made, still made in some parts of the world, which you'll see in a moment, and was made, is that, well, we can't let these people be free and go around the street, because God knows what they'll do. They're causing issues. We really have to do something about it. That is the imperative. We must employ extreme coercion. And in this province, it involved people literally being shackled to walls before the Waterford Hospital existed. It happened all over North America, the world generally. That was the beginning. That was the choice. We have to do something. We have to control them. They're out of hand. So we can't just let them do whatever they want, so it has to be we let them do nothing. Now, what's fascinating is when you go through the history of how we deal with people with mental illnesses, that is actually not terribly an ancient idea. It used to be that we just kind of ignored people with severe mental illness to death to the point they lived outside of town or wandered between the walls of the city-states, which we're still trying to do, I suppose. But we did hit that point where we started chaining people to walls. And this was the false dichotomy that generated that. This was spoken about intelligently, academically, and so forth. And it's still happening. This is 2011. That's Nigeria. The man on the frame of the picture of the edge is a traditional healer. I presume the man who is tied to the pole is likely someone suffering from schizophrenia. There is no healthcare system to speak of in the country to deal with mental illness at all. We are living in utopia compared to Nigeria. The treatment that is being employed is the individual is tied to a pole and left out in the elements and occasionally beaten. And I guess you can see the look of stern authority from the fellow here telling him how to be. This is modern. This is not ancient history. This is now. This is happening in the world now. Not just in Africa, other places. That's what that dichotomy produced. Then we have other ones. The one everyone thinks of as the good one. Is it a moral failing or is it an illness? Well, that seems like a sharp dichotomy, which we're still debating in certain ways, believe it or not. Is it an individual or local versus state responsibility? Everybody here, or a lot of people here, probably know who Dorothea Dix is. Dorothea Dix was, I would suggest, probably the most powerful mental health advocate in the history of North America. She was a lady whom powerfully advocated that people with mental health concerns should not be left chained to the wall, but rather should be given fit, humane places to live, which were large, spacious, equipped with natural light, air blowing through, and should be regarded as people who could be treated and therefore brought to maximum functioning. Ms. Dix never quite got to the point where she appreciated the concept of autonomy the way many of us do right now, but she certainly tried her best. And because of her and her efforts, we saw the evolution of what we think of as the psychiatric system in a mental institution type sense. The first success of Ms. Dix, which was groundbreaking at the time, was the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, the first Kirkbride Plan, as I put it here, hospital in 1848. Here she is. As I note in the brackets, she tended to think that mental illness was a problem of white educated people, for some reason. She actually said that black people didn't get mental illnesses. That happened. That's the way it was, okay? She looks like a very noble sort. So she was truly trying her best and probably sincerely meant everything she was doing, became extraordinarily famous, had audiences with the Pope, was generally a hero, well received by everybody, got right to the heart of the legislature by pointing to their colleague who developed psychosis and convinced them to give them money. And it started this great infrastructural revolution, which a lot of people made a lot of money off of. And they built a tremendous number of huge Gothic Kirkbride plan institutions, like this one, the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum. Now, Ms. Dix was a nurture person. She was a person who thought that these conditions came due to someone's interaction with the environment, mostly, sort of like we do now. That's the popular vein at the moment. So this was all about getting people into a great environment to get them back to functioning. So this is heaven and utopia compared to the dungeon, right? And there's this guy. This is Dr. Henry Cotton. Dr. Cotton becomes the primary operator of that same wonderful utopian hospital. In around 1907, Dr. Cotton was a very prominent and preeminent psychiatrist, and he was a nature guy. So he shifted from nurture to nature, and what Dr. Cotton thought was most mental illnesses were caused by infections. So what he liked to do over time was remove teeth, then tonsils. Then if that didn't work and the person was still psychotic, now we're going to move on to other things. We're going to move on to testicles, we're going to move on to digits, we're going to move on to parts of your colon, we're going to move on to your gallbladder. We are going to dissect you and vivisect you while you are alive. And approximately 45% of the people he did this to died because it was the pre-antibiotic era. This is a few years after the attempt to build utopia. What does that say? At the State Hospital at Trenton, New Jersey, under the brilliant leadership of the medical director, Dr. Henry A. Cotton, there is on foot the most searching, aggressive, and profound scientific investigation that has yet been made of the whole field of mental and nervous disorders. There is hope, high hope, for the future. That's what was happening. Now, am I saying this to demonize anything? No. What I'm saying is that happened because of the false dichotomy. That happened because, well, is it nurture, is it nature? We got to do something. So let's start taking people's teeth out. That's something anyway. It continued until the 1960s, long after he was gone. There was still arbitrary tooth removal occurring in his hospital. That became the norm. This is what he did. He was a medical pioneer, a hero. He got awards. He was, however, investigated by an individual named Dr. Phyllis Greenacre, who found him, quote, singularly peculiar. Like you would be, right? This happens a lot in this story. But what was really happening at the same time that Dr. Cotton was on the go, essentially becoming something like something out of a horror movie, to be gentle, is the Kirkbride plan was failing. And it was failing because the governments of the various states in particular that were supporting those hospitals were pulling the plug on the funding. There was a drive to get more and more people under control. Institutions that were intended to house 150 people were now housing 1,000, and there was less money. And this is where we get the nightmare period of mental health care. You have powerfully and profoundly overcrowded institutions that are horribly underfunded because everyone is starting to pull the plug on the funds, having these dichotomous discussions, and there's people like Dr. Cotton who are leading the whole thing. So if you can picture a place where people are sitting around in their own feces, getting their teeth randomly excreted and various parts of their bodies cut off, you're getting the picture. That's what actually happened, okay? And it happened because of the intersection of politics, economy, and these false dichotomies. Byberry, this is Philadelphia, much down the road from Dr. Cotton. It's in 1946. Byberry was a work farm. You talk about taking responsibility and so forth. It was a work farm which suffered the same fate as many of the more grandiose Kirkbride plan institutions. The funding was cut off. There wasn't money to support the services. What ends up happening is just like the Kirkbride facilities, it became overcrowded, it became overrun, and some conscientious objectors who were Quakers were appointed to work there rather than to go to war. And they went there and they saw what was going on. And when they realized that one day they'd have to leave, having seen what was going on, they decided that they had a duty to take some pictures. So they took some pictures. And these pictures ended up published in Life magazine in 1946. That's probably the most famous one. These are mental health patients in Byberry in 1946. And what was noted at the time when those pictures were released, and people said it quite seriously and not in any hyperbolic sense, Americans had just seen a lot of Holocaust pictures, and now they were seeing this in their own states, and they didn't know what was going on. This wasn't going on because someone wanted it to. This was going on because these places were built, and then a variety of dichotomous concepts organically were utilized over time to pull the plug on the money. And then these people are out of sight and out of mind. They have no autonomy, and this is just nature taking its course. This is what humans will do to each other. It was all about institutional versus community. The Byberry period thought, you can't let these people out into the community. They can't handle it. It's just too dangerous and so forth. After Byberry, and Byberry was a big part of that, we hit kind of the period we're into now, which is still unfolding, and that's the deinstitutionalization period. Now, before we all pat ourselves in the back and we think that we've done great things and figured everything out, what drove all of these periods was money, mostly. It was money in building those facilities. Then it was too much money to keep them going. Then it got to be a money problem after Byberry when people started bringing these pesky lawsuits. True enough, it happened. It was part of it. Then you have all these facilities which are starting to fall down. The politicians can't really afford them. There's starting to be lawsuits. There's social outcry. So what's the solution? The solution is community care, deinstitutionalization. And everything starts to close. And places that have thousands of people in them, or at least 1,000, get cut down to almost nothing. And it's all about, we're going to do this with community service now, folks. And it did not happen. In the beginning, it was almost non-existent. We've gradually got to the point where we've built some up, and we're doing a lot better than we were. But in the beginning, it was a free-for-all. I have some quotes, right? Here's a quote right here from a psychiatrist, the medical superintendent of Queen Street Mental Health Care Centre in Ontario. Pre-explicit messages were associated with budget cuts, close units, lock the door, and don't use them. That meant you could use the staff that were operating a unit and consolidate. I can remember reading pretty specific directives that this was what the government wanted to see happen. This fellow right here, a psychiatrist, noted, "We said there was going to be follow-up, but the fact of the matter is that nobody really understood, so the bureaucrats were delighted to get them out of hospitals, and only later did we say, hey, this is crazy. What about housing? What about recreation?" That's a psychiatrist. When a psychiatrist says something is crazy, in a political sense, you got to pay attention, right? They were just trying to save money and deal with the problem. The focus was not on looking after people or delivering health care. The focus was on dealing with budgets, justified continuously by false dichotomies. And at this particular point, what I'll say is, during that deinstitutionalization period, and I'm going to be very blunt about this, there were people over here who were all very sweet, sweet, light, light, humanity, save the people, and their sentiment was utilized to defund these institutions, and they actually helped nobody. They actually, in their spirit of good intentions, created a situation where it got bad. And we've been recovering ever since. We're still recovering. It's not that we're at the bottom, but this has happened. It was cheap. We had no plan to integrate people in the community. It worked for a bit, and now we end up here. So everyone's heard the phrase, prisons are the new asylums. There are more people in the United States with serious mental illness in prison than there are in mental hospitals. These people didn't disappear. They were not cured. They ended up kicked out onto the street. They ended up in trouble with various systems, and they ended up like this man, who is very sadly and ironically named DJ Young. And he's in a mental health unit in a segregation facility. Same in Canada. This is Howard Saper. I'll suggest in the 90s we started drifting back towards nature because of genetics, which seemed hopeful. There was a lot of hopeful studies going on, still are. Bipolar disorder in particular was quite heavily focused on at the time, but then something happened. We're now back to nurture. We're lurching again. Now it's all about trauma. And this guy is a psychologist who's actually arguing for ceasing to look for the scientific causes of mental health concerns because really it's all about unemployment, so forth and so on. And a minute ago, somebody mentioned the question, well, you're really talking about trying to fix society. In a sense, this is underneath all of that. It's a very complicated problem. So the question I ask is, do we get anywhere by constantly lurching back and forth through this very complicated area and repeating ourselves and going over our own tracks and not bringing anything new? And here's Mr. Trump. So, after all of that, we now have a guy who a minute ago was too crazy to be president, talking about bringing back mental hospitals in a major way while referring to people as sickos, which is lovely. And this is a quote from an article from The Atlantic. "The devil, though, would be in the details. Funding and regulating these places extremely well would help them avoid the fate of their gruesome predecessors from past centuries." So that's it. Funding and regulating these places extremely well. So you get to a point where you're asking yourself the question, are you playing with fire to even go there? How dangerous is it? What do we do? Have we even begun to learn what happened? And I'm going to suggest to you that as a society and a people, I'm very, very concerned that we haven't learned much about what happened, because when you look up most of these places, like Trenton State Hospital, you get directed to paranormal ghost hunt sites where you can pay $25 a night to go camping, where people died. It's fun for people in the community. We're in an era right now where it's absolutely impossible to say anything even vaguely discriminatory about virtually every defined identity politics group. You do a search on what happened in these places, and most of what comes up on Google is Halloween tours. Now, we are prominent and important people who are very aware of what's going on in this issue. We need to be alive to and internalize the fact that that is happening. We need to be alive to the fact that the structures that have been used, explicitly and implicitly to generate this, to make it happen, are still alive. And we need to wake up, and we need to focus on, let's not do that anymore. Let's not go back and forth between these very attractive, kind of soft, substantive concepts and have these vigorous debates that were actually had in some form or another 100 years ago. Let's actually look at what happened and say, okay, how do we not do that again? And how to create a system where the funding that is put in is relatively secure to the point that if it starts to function, somebody looking to get elected next term doesn't pull the rug out from under it without thinking about what it's going to look like in 10 years, and more people end up down in a mid-seg in HMP. That's what we're talking about. There's no easy solutions to this. This is what I just said. Number two, people have continuously selfishly capitalized on and exploited false dichotomies in the pursuit of personal gain, consciously or otherwise. It has been relentless. Everyone from Dorothea Dix to Mr. Cotton and Dr. Cotton were all heroes. They all got medals. They all got awards. They went to lovely conferences and so forth. They met the Pope, and we still have the problems. What I suggest at the top, which is really the inspiration for why I went this route on false dichotomies, and I'll plew up. We all heard for a very, very long time that the Waterford Hospital would be replaced and dealt with. It's ancient. We all know that. We know it has a lot of problems. Now we all know the economy is where it is for a while. It isn't bust all the time, just like it isn't boom all the time. It'll come back the way it always does to some extent, and it'll bust again, and life is long and history is long. But I find myself in listening to the people who are associated with my organization in various other sectors. Here we are again. Now we're into, we can't deal with that hospital right now. The solution is these community services, which we're having difficulty to find, and it's all trauma anyway, and this person over here has a problem with psychiatrists, and this person over here has a problem with that person, and we're starting to contextualize all of these issues into such a whole that it's become very easy to just ignore the Waterford again. And we're going to ignore it for another 40 years if we're not careful, because it's a big ticket item. Am I saying build it tomorrow? No. Am I saying it's the solution to everything? No. But I am saying that it is the moral responsibility of everybody in this room to realize that something has to be done down there. We can't have a facility that old, integrated with any type of community-based system, continue to exist and expect any positive outcomes. We can't ignore it to death. We can't let it fall apart. We can't let it, some people have, by the way, so I guess you can. But we're going to try to ensure that doesn't happen. And that's a false dichotomy. It's not just, and I have it listed here, a building versus community services. It's both. You need all parts of the system to function, and they need to be developed and deployed reasonably and sensibly. It's not one or the other. And we have to grab that bull by the horns and realize that's the case and not trick ourselves or be tricked into turning away from that. Because otherwise, you're relying on another group of people to pop up in 20 years and make all these arguments again. People have been making these arguments ever since the 70s. The same argument over and over again. I think we all know it really, but let's try to avoid getting sidetracked. What I suggest is we have to immediately stop thinking in these false dichotomies. We have to immediately embrace what I think is very important and has been missing for most of the history of this issue. The contextual protection of autonomy of people is number one. And realize this cycle has been going on for so long, and there aren't good guys or bad guys, and there aren't easy answers, and there aren't easy solutions, and there may never be. But that doesn't mean you can't deal with the problem in a way that doesn't bring back and aggravate what has happened in the past. And only that's really going to do it. It's not really relevant to me whether times are good or bad at a given point in time, because it will change. What is relevant is that people keep thinking the right way. That they don't get lost in this frame-by-frame view of things where they can't see the forest for the trees. Once upon a time, oh, it was going to be great. We had all kinds of money. Things were going excellent. We had all these plans. Oh, God, we don't have any money. Well, now we're doomed. We're finished forever. We're never going to stand up again. As mature people, we know this is not true. We know things ebb and flow. We know things rise and fall. We can't predict things. Nobody has a crystal ball. But we can't lose sight of what's going on. I'm going to leave that alone because those remaining questions are perhaps not as on point with what I just said. But I gather there's some opportunity for questioning now.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll open up the floor for any questions. Right in the back there, Mike.
Thank you. Great presentation, Mark.
Thanks.
My question is it a problem of categorization? Like, if we just call everything mental illness, then, we don't know what to do with it. But if we kind of divide it up, just like we do with cancers, there are different kind of cancers, you treat them differently, and now with genomics, we're treating them, even the same cancer in different ways. Is it the problem that we're not properly diagnosing and therefore not properly prescribing, or what do you see as being the main issue from your perspective?
Well, this might not directly answer your question, but what I have noticed is that from a political and from an activist point of view, it has been very beneficial to the mental health movement to talk about the group of people with mental health concerns to be as large as possible. So we now have a social concept wherein we see those figures of 20% and so on and so forth. I think it is perfectly sensible to realize that there are very considerable variations within that group of people. And I know from my experiences, for instance, dealing with people who are hospitalized, that we are often talking about people who experience psychosis. And I have, not always, but it does seem that way a lot of the time. And I do note that in all of the lovely, happy destigmatization discussions that have gone on, we don't seem to be pretty far along the road in destigmatizing people who are psychotic. It still seems to be a pretty tough subject for society. People still don't seem to want to deal with the reality that that is happening, okay? So to get directly to your, point about categorizations and so forth, I've always been concerned that people who have severe and persistent mental health problems are getting forgotten in this general positive tide that we've seen in the area. And I don't think there's anything wrong whatsoever with taking special steps to ensure those most vulnerable people are not forgotten. I'd rather not fracture things to the point that it's unmanageable, but it is important, I think, for people to acknowledge it. Yes, there are a population of people who are extremely wanting. And let's not just focus on, a phrase that you hear sometimes, and it's probably a bit unfair and not always appropriate, is the word well. People who are relatively functioning may have some minor issues, getting a lot of resources and attention from the system because it's easy to address, versus someone who's in and out of an isolation room with nobody. We can't forget about the person in the isolation room, and we always do. So that's probably not a direct answer, but yeah. Okay.
Another question from the floor? Right over here, Barb.
Hi. I got to admit, you're really talking like a lawyer there, and I was getting a little bit lost at times. All right, from a nursing background. Yeah. But you talked. What was the trauma thing? Are you agreeing that trauma causes mental health issues, or because we're in the middle now of talking to government and that about presumptive legislation with workers' comp and that with PTSD and mental health issues and.
Yeah, it is obvious from the studies that trauma plays a role in many cases. I mean, trauma has even been associated with the emergence of bipolar disorder, right? So I'm not talking so much about what is objective reality in these areas. What I'm talking about is the fact that we tend to lurch back and forth strongly between concepts So when I reference trauma, I'm depicting it as the external force causing the problem without proper regard for what could be internal. And the other extreme is it's all internal, and let's forget about society, it's all in you. And when you look through the history of it, I mean, some of these external forces that have been posited over time to be the causes of mental illness have been utterly ludicrous. I mean, schizophrenia used to be associated with one's mother, right? Parenting styles and things like this. We have to be careful not to get lost in lurching back and forth, because what happens is we go from one project to the next, one way of approaching an issue to the next. Each one requires a plan and a forecast and some funding and some training, and the next thing you know, the government's changed, and now we're lurching another way, and where are we going, right? And often I find that this lurching back and forth is the direct product of the frustration of people who saw the failings of the previous system, which will soon be reincarnated in a couple of years. Well, I don't understand. They can't cure my condition with pills the way I would like, so it must be trauma. No one's helping me with my trauma. So I got all this talk therapy, but that didn't fix me, so someone needs to do something more serious, so let's go back to pills. And it does this, right? It waffles. And I'd rather stop waffling. I'd rather say, okay, well, we know we've done all this. It's all important. Let's try to make something different. So I'm not discounting it.
So Dr. Haggie made reference this morning of an announcement coming about the Waterford Hospital. Have your group been involved in the discussions around what's coming?
Well, I've been aware of general talk about the Waterford for some time. I'm not sure what that announcement is, no. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there was at some point there was $6 million announced, which I think might pave a part of the parking lot, but anyway.
Another question from the floor.
Yes.
Anne Kearney from School of Nursing. Mark, you're one of the most powerful speakers I've ever heard, so congratulations on a great talk.
Thank you.
You're obviously very bright, so I'm going to ask you to expand now and see if you have any advice for us, for the healthcare system in general, and what we can do to move that forward.
I was thinking about that earlier, and I'll approach it this way. I mean, by and large, everybody in this room is some form of professional, right? So we all exist within our systems, with our ideas, with our jargon and our concepts. I mean, and the lawyers are terrible for that. Like, law is probably the most rigid thing of all, right? You can't move that. That's like a mountain. You can't move law. It's very hard. So what I'm going to say is, you know, sort of just like how I keep reminding myself of the, I hate to use the word, but essentially form of insanity of what goes on in the court system respecting how we deal with mentally ill people. I remind myself of it and I realize it's not right, and I keep trying to do my little bit to make it better. And I talk like this, and I speak with people, and I try to think things through. So when you're inside of a system, yeah, you're going to get trained, you're going to get talked to, you're going to have paradigms to work with, but I think it's very, very important throughout the entire process to remain a critical thinker and to be aware that, you know, there's nothing really new under the sun. It's all been done before in different ways, not just in this area of life, but others. So look for what's actually happening on the results end as opposed to being in love with your system, unless there's some reason why you're prepared to go one way or the other, which is more complicated than just these are the rules or this is what we're doing now. So that might not be terribly helpful. I'm just saying maintain critical perspective and don't be too accepting, and don't ever get too comfortable and think everything is going to be fine or everything is not. Keep working at it mentally and critically. And if we all do that, then we don't get trapped in these strange circular debates about yay and nay and X and Y and yes and no, which really aren't truth, in my view.
Got time for one more question. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Erin Bala. I'm from Eastern Health, and I'm really wondering why we don't have more conversations about mental wellness. You know, we're always so reactive in the way that we care for people, and arguably we have an illness system, not a health system. So why is the conversation continuously about addressing mental illness? We should be talking about promoting mental wellness.
I don't take any major exception to that thinking at all. One of the reasons that I focus on what I focused on here today is largely because I see, in particular, a defined group of people who are severely underserved who tend to get forgotten about all the time. And that's when a minute ago, when I was talking about, you know, how we look at the population of people with mental health concerns, I mentioned conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and that is not to diminish any others, but it is to say that when a person is dealing with severe and persistent psychosis to the point that they have to be repeatedly hospitalized and they're in isolation, we need to pay special regard to ensure that that person is not simply left urinating in a bucket for an extended period, and we're not really doing that. And I know a lot of people want to help, and I know the medical professionals involved take it very seriously. I know everyone cares. It's just we're sort of trapped. So when I reference that isn't business about mental illness, I think that's at least partially inspired by that concern of mine. With respect to the broader concept of mental wellness, certainly that's something society should be engaged in. Who could oppose that, right? I just wonder sometimes if we're really talking about exactly the same thing. That is to say, you know, it's a deep conversation, but, you know, are we even talking about illnesses? We're talking about things that occur in people that produce severe disruption. Is it simply the opposite of wellness? I don't always know. It's a really complicated discussion that is probably beyond the time I got to answer. But I don't see them as mutually oppositional, and I took that focus for a specific reason, but certainly you make a very good point.
So, Mr. Gruchy, I'd like to say thank you again.